Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shavuot teaching with Rabbi Elliot Dorff, in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Brous.
First of all, I just want to reiterate my tremendous gratitude to this community for welcoming IKAR community. There's so much overlap between our two communities, and it's particularly meaningful and powerful to do this together on Shavuot. This moment when we are called to imagine our entire community standing together and receiving the revelation at Sinai. So thank you for welcoming us here with grace. And I am so humbled by the opportunity to be with my teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. And I just wanted to tell you two very quick things about Rabbi Dorff. And the way that I, as I tell the story of my own rabbinate, the way that you appear. The first is when I first moved out here as a New Yorker who came to do my 1 year at Ziegler before going back to JTS, because that's the way it used to be structured. I was so nervous and excited to meet Rabbi Elliot Dorff, whose books I had read and heard a lot about. The first thing that I came to when we moved out here in the summer before starting at Ziegler was Tisha B'Av. And I remember we met each other right on La Cienega, right outside of this building, and I saw you, and I was so excited. I said, "Oh my God, Rabbi Dorff, hello!" And then I immediately realized that one is not supposed to engage another with greetings on Tisha B'Av. And I thought, "Oh no, I'm doomed. My rabbinate is doomed." And Rabbi Dorff, without missing a beat, just smiled just like that and said, "Hello, welcome. It's so good that you're here." And I always thought about that because clearly Rabbi Dorff knew that one was not supposed to greet either on Tisha B'Av, but there was no way you weren't going to greet somebody back. And that depth of humanity is precisely what Rabbi Panitz is talking about. And years later, when I wrote my master's thesis, I was working on applying Rambam's laws of Hilchot Tshuva, our Jewish tradition's approach to reconciliation and healing after really grave breaches in relationships, which is not unrelated to what we're talking about tonight. I found that there were many scholars who wrote about our Jewish tradition's approach to forgiveness and reconciliation, and there were many scholars who wrote in international affairs about the kind of diplomacy that engages in the questions of reparation and repair. But there were very few people who were speaking in both languages, except for Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who was speaking that way already 25 years ago, probably long before that too. And so you have been my teacher and our teacher for so many years, and in all the most important ways. And so I really thank you. It's a great blessing.
But I'm only 20.
The topic that we are discussing this evening is called "In the Age of Rage, Can We See Each Other?" And thank you to Rabbi Schatz and Rabbi Panitz for inviting us into the evening to start us off in conversation. This is something that Rabbi Dorff and I has been top of mind for both of us. I think in some ways for all of us, because we are living in a time of a great shattering. It's a shattering of norms. It's a shattering of assumptions. There is pain all around us. And that pain is not only outside in the world, but also inside in our families. Almost every day, if not every week, I have a conversation with somebody who tells me that they simply can't talk to their parents anymore because they don't share the same values, or that they cannot engage in conversation with their children anymore, and they're afraid that they're losing each other because they just don't see the world the same way, and it's so painful. And it's not only happening in our families, but also happening in our democracy. In the most global sense, we're seeing a kind of extreme polarization that people are likening only in American history to the Civil War era. And so I heard a couple of weeks ago a podcast that The Daily did with a professor named Robert Pape that some of you may have heard. He's a professor at University of Chicago, and he was speaking about the rise of political violence in our time. He calls the time that we're living in right now the era of violent populism. And I want to just share very briefly what he warns about so that we can keep this as a backdrop through our conversation. He says the most important fact about political violence in America today is that tens of millions of Americans on both sides of the political spectrum see political violence as acceptable today. He says that this era started about 10 years ago, and once you have tens of millions of Americans who support political violence, this creates a kind of spiral, a descent. And it's instead of us pulling ourselves out of this spiral, it's actually getting much worse. The data shows that in 2020, 10% of the body politic believed that political violence was the answer. And now, only 6 years later, it's double that number, which means literally 20% of the American population believes that the answer to our pain and our worries right now is to pick up arms and kill each other. So the question that we're asking in the age of rage, can we see each other, could not be more relevant, could not be more urgent. And when we look at relevant and urgent and extremely consequential questions, we look deeply into the past in order to try to find wisdom that comes from a different era, but that can root us back in core values and create for us a new shared language about how we navigate the present. So I want to start by saying literally everything is at stake right now: our families, our democracy, and the world. And now we enter into Yantif, asking what resources our Torah can offer us to help us navigate this incredibly consequential moment that we're living through. So, Rabbi Dorff.
Okay, so this is Shavuot, which, according to the rabbis at any rate, is the time of the giving of the Torah. And what you probably have in mind is some of the stories in the Torah itself, where God is at Sinai and he gives the Ten Commandments and all of that. But if you take a look at the first source on the sheet, I'm going to give you a moment to read it, and then I'll tell you something really interesting about it. It's the one from Shemot Rabbah. Just if you will read it.
If it's okay, maybe I'll read it out loud for accessibility, and also for folks who might be with us on Zoom who don't have the sheet in front of them.
Fair enough.
Or do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
Doesn't matter. Go ahead.
So this is from Shemot Rabbah 5:9. Come and see how the voice would emerge to each one of Israel, each and every one in accordance with his capability. The elderly according to their capability, the young men according to theirs, the children according to their capability, the nursing babies according to their capability, the women according to their capability, and Moses too, according to his. As it is stated, Moses would speak, and God would answer him with a voice, quoting Exodus 19:19, with a voice that he could withstand. And likewise, it says, the voice of the Lord is powerful, b'koach, in Psalms. It does not say God's capability b'kocho, but rather b'koach, according to the capability of each and every one, and even pregnant women according to their capability. That is, each and every one according to their capability.
Okay, so now I want to tell you a story. Good way to start, right, for a rabbi? I do a lot of interfaith work, and the year before COVID, Brentwood Presbyterian Church decided, well, they have services at 9 in the morning and 11 in the morning, and between 10 and 11, they have adult education. So they decided that they were going to do the religions of the world between 10 and 11 over the course of Sundays, right? And I was Judaism. So I said to them, before we get into the content of Judaism in any way, you have to understand its mode. It's very argumentative. Right? You know, the standard joke is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But once I was doing a Scholar in Residence weekend, and I mentioned that, and a man came up to me afterward and said, do you really need 2 Jews for 3 opinions? Right? And I said to them, it's not because we're nasty to each other, although we might be. It's because the tradition is based on a very deep epistemological humility, that is, humility about what we can know. And consequently, the only way that none of us is omniscient. God may be all-knowing, but we're not. And so the only way that we can find truth or goodness or wisdom is by talking to each other and arguing with each other. And then I talked about God, Torah, and Israel. And a man came up to me afterward, late 50s, I would imagine, and he told me he was an aeronautical engineer at Northrop Grumman. And he had done that for about 25 years. And he said, now I understand something. And I said to him, what do you understand? He said, in all those years, whenever I would suggest that we do something differently, I would get slammed down, except when I had a Jewish boss. So this idea of being able to challenge things and to think outside the box is not something that is normal for most people. One other story quickly. For 20-some years, I did a program for the Anti-Defamation League all over the country called Bearing Witness. It was a program for teachers in Catholic high schools. And ADL's interest was try to get these people to understand, why did the church not do what it should have done during the Second World War? And now, given Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican document on the Jews, that completely revolutionized the Catholic-Jewish relations. Now, what has changed since then? So I have a group they're almost all Catholic, right? So I told them, I'm going to teach you your first rabbinic saying. And I write on the board in English characters, Lo Habai Shan Lo Made. And I say to them, repeat after me, and they 3 times. Lo Habai Shan Lo Made. So I say to them, you're very trusting, because you have no idea what you just said, okay? And beyond that, what it says is that a bashful person will not learn. It's from Pirkei Avot, right? So I know that when your priest says something, you just accept it. But that's not the rabbinic way. So you have to challenge me. It takes me 3 days before they start doing that, right? Because it's not, Jews tend to think that the whole world is Jewish and everybody thinks and acts the same way we do. It's just not the case. In the vast majority of traditions, you just accept what the authority figure says. And here, this is the epistemological basis of it, right? That each person understands revelation according to his or her ability, and that ability will change over time for every one of us, depending upon what we learn, what our experiences are, and the like. And then the next thing we have on the outline is two verses from Leviticus 19, from Kedoshim. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kindred, but incur no guilt on their account. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow as yourself. I am God. What's being said here is that the ability to interact with people, even criticizing people if it's done right, can be the basis for none other than love. Mm-hmm. Right, and you shouldn't keep it in your heart. No vengeance, and not even not even bearing a grudge. If you really want to be able to interact with people, you have to be able to talk to them about what really matters. Now, it has to be done with respect, and it has to be done with listening, because you can't start out by saying, "I know it all, and you just have to trust me." Right? But it is the case that what the Torah itself is saying is that the way to fruitful and even loving communities and families is if people are willing to really understand have epistemological humility. That is, understand that whatever it is you think is right or whatever you think is true, right, you may have very good reason for it, and you should by all means express that. But you should also be able to listen to other people. I told you I do a lot of interfaith work. I've also done a lot of things I've been on 3 federal government commissions and 1 state government commission. And let me just tell you, there are smart and moral people in the world who are not Jewish. Okay? Now, once you start with that, then what you need to do is to sort of open up your ears and listen to what people have to say. Again, you may not agree with them in the end, right? And then you have to explain why. But you have to start out with the presumption that other people are smart and moral. Mm. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are they saying, and why do I believe it or why do I not believe it? Mm-hmm. And why do they believe it? right? That's the only kind of interactions that we can have that will not lead to what Rabbi Brous was just talking about, namely to complete violence. Rabbi Brous actually put together the rest of these texts, in which what we're going to be doing is talking about what happens in rabbinic texts about this, about arguing with each other. Some of them, as you will see, some of the texts refer to really nice relationships, and some of them not so. The rabbis were human beings after all, and sometimes they really knew how to get along with each other, and sometimes not. And it seems to me, to both of us, that we should learn from both of them, right? So do you want to take the next? Go ahead.
Yeah, now I want to go back to text 1 for a moment. And also, it's our hope that at the end of our conversation, we'll be able to engage in discourse with all of you. And so we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So please think about what's on your mind as we're going through this. But one of the reasons I love the text at the top from Shmot Rabbah so much is because it really speaks to the fact that Revelation is incomplete without all of these variety of perspectives. And so thinking about the way that we self-isolate in these ever-narrowing ideological bubbles, what we're losing when we don't engage each other. And the whole model of multi-faith work is so important, I think, for precisely this reason, but not only between faiths, also within our own communities. And the slivers are getting tighter and tighter, and how important it is to recognize that if you don't have a pregnant woman and an elderly person and and someone with this life experience and someone with this life experience, then we are denying the full breadth of what Torah can offer us. And so how that is a testament to how essential it is to have all of our voices and interpretations in the conversation. Okay, so what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes now is share with you an arc of a rabbinic narrative that I'm going to credit to my friend and colleague, Rabbi Daniel Roth, who is the brother of our beloved community member, Hannah Roth, who might be in the room right now. Hi, Hannah. So Rabbi Daniel Roth is a brilliant rabbi and teacher in Jerusalem, and he spent many, many years really investigating and uncovering, I would say, some extraordinary texts in order to make a particular argument that we're going to share with you tonight. And so I share, you'll know some of these texts, and some of them you probably haven't heard before unless you're a student of Rabbi Daniel Roth's. But I want to lift up the way that he teaches these texts, because for us it seems that there's a very powerful warning that's coming from our tradition that we would do well to hear in this moment. So looking at text 3, which comes from Eruvin 13b, Ravi Abba said that Shmuel said, this text may be familiar to many of you, for 3 years Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued over a particular matter. We don't know what the particular matter was that they argued about. But one group, one of the schools of thought said Halacha kamotenu, that the law is the way that we hold, and the other one said Halacha kamotenu, no, the law is the way that we hold. And then, of course, I say of course as if this is just a pedestrian turn of events, Yatzabat Kol, the voice of God comes down from the heavens and says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hen, that actually both this school of thought and this school of thought's perspective, they are both the words of the living God, v'halacha kaveit Hillel. But the law will be determined according to the teaching of one school of thought, not the other, to the teaching of the school of thought of Hillel. And I mean, the whole setup here is quite extraordinary, and the fact that you know it and have learned it before should not make it any less so. The idea that two schools of thought are arguing and God actually enters into the human conversation in order to say you're both right is absolutely breathtaking. And then the determination that even though both are right, that one of them will be the way that the human community will follow is quite remarkable. And of course, the rabbis of the Gemara then ask, well, if they're both the words of the living God, so then why does the law follow according to Hillel and not Shammai? How could God possibly determine that one is more right than the other? And as you may remember, the answer that is offered is mipnei shenochin va'aluvin hayu, because those teachers from the school of Beit Hillel were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted. And when they taught the halakha, they would teach their own statements and they would teach the teachings of Beit Shammai. Moreover, the text says, when they formulated their teachings and they cited a dispute, they prioritized the teachings of their opponents, even over their own, in deference to their opponent. And of course, there's a banner up on the wall of my kids' school that says "Nochin va'aluvin hayu," and that we should strive also to remember to have humility and to have a kind of compassion and groundedness when we engage in even the most in the fiercest of debates. And I want to just invite us to think about what it would mean to take that seriously now as a charge, given the heat in our current political climates, or even the heat at your Shabbos dinner table, what it would mean. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons that we fell in love with Shalhevet, frankly, and sent our kids there for school, because the practice at Shalhevet was that every single week, the entire student body, students and faculty and staff, would stop what they were doing and go into the gym. And they would engage in difficult discourse about hard topics. And the principle was nochin va'aluvin hayu. And so what would happen is someone would share a perspective, and then another, like, should humans be cloned? And another student would stand up and say, I know that Yoni suggested that humans should not be cloned because of X, Y, and Z, and I believe differently. I believe this. And I was so struck about 10 years ago when we started looking for high schools. My kid just graduated college yesterday, our oldest, that there was an environment in the world that was still trying to teach this principle in a living and active way.
Well, my granddaughter is getting married this summer. So,
even better.
I am old. But the other piece of this is, I have a PhD in philosophy, and this kind of a text, I think, would make philosophers crawl the wall, right? Because what it's saying is that what really matters is not just the argument. What matters is the moral characters of the people who are advancing the argument. Right? And so, because what's important in life, definitely, by the way, I really believe in the life of the mind. I wouldn't have done a doctorate in philosophy if I didn't, or for rabbinical school for that matter, right? But the life of the mind has its restrictions, its limitations. And a large part of what is important in life is just the way people behave and the way people interact with each other, even when they disagree, maybe especially when they disagree. Right? That the point is not the argument per se. The point is, how do you get along afterward? I was telling Rabbi Brous before that I just completed an article for the Journal of Jewish Ethics on apology in Japan, in America, and in Jewish sources. So in Japan, if you're in a car accident, the first thing you do is apologize to each other. It has nothing to do with accepting responsibility. It's because in Japan, there's a very strong sense of being a community. And if there was some mishap, like a car accident, the first thing to be worried about is the tear in the communal fabric that this might have caused. And therefore, you apologize first, and then you worry about, who's responsible. And as a matter of fact, this article, the article on which I was basing this, was written by Professor Arthur Rosette, with whom I taught Jewish law at the law school at UCLA for many years, but he also wrote this with a scholar of Japanese law. And one of the things they point out there is that when Japanese people come here to work here, let's say as executives in some firm, they are told, if you're in a car accident, don't apologize. Right? Because America is the exact opposite. In America, we are Americans. Being an American is a voluntary act. To become an American is very hard. If you weren't born here, to become an American is very hard. But if you are an American and you haven't committed a felony, then you can go to any consulate or embassy of the United States outside this country, fill out a form, and renounce your citizenship. And in fact, a number of Americans do this every year, primarily for tax reasons. Okay, but that's because being an American is a completely voluntary association. Judaism is in between the Japanese and the Americans on this, right? On the one hand, it's a very communitarian society. So if you were born Jewish or you are reborn Jewish through the rites of conversion, then you are Jewish for the rest of your life, no matter what you do. Right? If you convert to another religion, you lose the privileges of being Jewish. You can't be counted as part of a minyan, can't be married as a Jew. The Jewish community is not responsible for supporting you if you are poor and so on. But you still have all the obligations of the Jewish tradition because Yisrael, Avo Pi Shechata Yisraelu. A Jew, even if he has sinned or she has sinned, is still a Jew. Right? It's an organic sense of community, not a voluntary sense of community. But the other side of it is that the Jewish tradition believes that each and every person was created in the image of God. So in that sense, it's more like the American tradition, which also have a very strong sense of individualism, but for a different reason. In America, we hold these truths to be created, to be self-evident, that we were created by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I am an individual with rights as an American. But as a Jew, the central Jewish story is Exodus Sinai. We leave Exodus not as individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments. That's, as I tell my Catholic audiences, that's the beginning of Jewish guilt. Right? But Catholics tell me, we have that cornered. You don't know what guilt is. Okay? So, I mean, the Jewish tradition on this thing is we are an organic community, but each and every individual is precious, not because we have rights, but because we were created in the image of God. So the Jewish tradition is really in between the American tradition and the Japanese tradition on this kind of thing. But what it means is that we have to, as American Jews, but in particular here now as Jews, we have the obligation to see the image of God in every other person also, even if you really disagree with that person. That doesn't mean you accept everything that another person says or does. There are a whole list of laws, 613 commandments in the Torah, a whole list of laws that define what is appropriate behavior and what's not. And you can, in Leviticus, right? You should surely rebuke your fellow Jew, or non-Jew for that matter, if they've done something really wrong. But you've got to do it with respect, and you've got to, you have to, by the way, the Torah says in Deuteronomy 23, somebody who is executed for committing a capital offense has to be taken down from the gallows before nightfall, because a hanging person is a curse of God, right? Because even somebody who has done something that merits the death penalty, whatever you think about that, that's a whole other story. But even somebody who merits the death penalty we have the duty to bury that person respectfully, right? So it goes that far as to what being created in the image of God is all about. Maybe we should get to the next one because we're going to run out of time. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I'll take us through this fairly quickly, but the text number 4 from Tosefta Yevamot essentially says, even though they disagreed so fiercely that for 3 years they were in this heated debate, and not only on this issue, but on many other issues as well, even still, they still let their children marry each other, which actually is more than just a nice thing. They disagreed on questions of personal status. And even still, they were able to overcome those differences and say, essentially, we are part of the same community. Text number 5 asks the question of how it was that two individuals, Hillel and Shammai, and then their entire schools of thought, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, how it was that they were able to overcome their differences and stay connected to each other, not just as community, but even really as family. Because of the intermarriage of their children. And so I want to share this with you. Look at this text from Tosefta Sota number 5, because I think this is absolutely critical for us today. Because they say perhaps it'll rise in your mind that since Beit Shammai says something's impure and Beit Hillel says it's pure, if one is prohibiting and one is permitting, why should I study Torah at all? If everything is an acceptable answer, if revelation really is different to every person in the way they heard it, then what really was revelation? Maybe there's no actual answer to Torah. And the answer that they say is that actually God created all of it, all of that diversity of views and opinions. And look at the end of the passage from Tosefta. So what are we to do? To make for your heart chambers within chambers, and bring into your heart the words of Shammai and the words of Hillel, the words of those who say impure and the words of those who say pure. That our work as Jews and as people of faith is to build capacious hearts that actually can hold a multiplicity of truths. I just want us to reflect on that in light of the growing extremism that we're seeing in this current political moment. And again, you don't have to point to protests on campuses to see this. We see this in ourselves and in people we love. There's a growing sense of right and wrong that where we're always right and they're always wrong, whoever the they is. And what our tradition says is that actually our job is to recognize that our hearts have many chambers and that there's room in my heart for your truth and for your truth, for your narrative and for my narrative. And I'm still going to believe that mine is more right than yours, but there's room for your truth in my heart too. Just hold that thought for a moment as we continue to put forward the argument. Do you want to jump in?
I just want and contrast that with the next one, where the rabbis really, I'll just say, act badly. Okay? I'll read it so those who are on Zoom can hear. This is from Mishnah Shabbat. And these are among the halachot, the laws that the sages who went up to visit him said in the upper story of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Garon. It turned out that when the people expressing opinions were counted, the students of Beit Shammai outnumbered the students of Beit Hillel, and they issued decrees with regard to 18 matters on that day in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai. This is basically, you've got 2 more people in the House of Representatives, and you have 2 more people in the Senate, and therefore you make the law according to what you want, and don't take into account what the other side wants. And by the way, it's not just Republicans versus Democrats. It's happened, often in the history of our country, and it's unfortunate. I mean, I'm old enough to remember. Now, this is a long time ago, but I still remember that back in the 50s, I was in high school at the time, the members of Congress were a little bit left of center and a little bit right of center, so that Republicans and Democrats could actually socialize together, and they often did bipartisan kinds of things. That sounds like impossible in our day, right? But that's really that was a functioning government. And that was a government where people were literally listening to each other. Mm. I mean, as late as about 10 years ago, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Scalia definitely did not agree, but they socialized together, right? And so you need to be able to do that kind of thing if you're going to be having not just a functioning society, but a thriving society.
So now, turn the page, if you will. We're going to look at text number 7. So we know now, we hear from the Mishnah that when Beit Shammai was able to get the upper hand they did as soon as they had the numeric majority and they were able to push through these 18 laws they did. And then look at text number 7. This is from Shabbat 17a. And it says, they struck a sword in the study hall. And they said, one who seeks to enter the study hall, let him enter. And one who seeks to leave may not leave. And on that day, V'oto hayom, haya Hillel kafuf. On that day, Hillel was bowed or bent or broken or humbled. I couldn't even figure out how best to capture it, so I put all the options here. Was forced to sit before Shammai like one of the students. So the great Hillel here is completely humiliated in the Beit Midrash that day. And then the Gemara goes on to say, that day was as difficult for Israel as the day of the golden calf, the day of this incredible, treacherous act against God. That what happened in that Beit Midrash on that day wasn't just that they got the numeric majority and so they overturned Roe v. Wade. That's not all that they did. It wasn't just the legal consequences of pushing through a wildly unpopular set of practices as the new law. It's that they struck a sword in the study hall and they completely humiliated their opponents. And here's where I really thank Rabbi Roth, because those texts are fairly well known and accessible to us. But the following texts I had never seen until I learned them with this wonderful teacher, who, by the way, is a teacher of Torah and a peace builder, who's really dedicated his life to building bridges between Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem, and is doing absolutely extraordinary work. And he's come out to talk at IKAR before, and maybe we can do something together when Hannah convinces him to come back. So look at text number 8 for a second from the Yerushalmi. That day, it says in the Gemara, that day was as hard for Israel as the day the golden calf was made. Rabbi Yoshua Onaya taught, the students of Beit Shammai stood below and killed the students of Beit Hillel. The students of Shammai, just in case you didn't know what it meant when they struck a sword in the Beit Midrash. So now we've gone through pushing through some unpopular laws to humiliating them to actually committing murder. And if you look in the Shulchan Aruch in text 9 from Orach Chaim 580, these are the days on which terrible events happened to our forefathers. And it is fitting to fast on that day when that occurred. On the 9th of Adar, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai divided. So what the Shulchan Aruch adds is a date and a sense of historic responsibility that over the course of time, we should all recognize that what happened that day was so terrible that we now fast in response to the horrific acts that happened then. Why? Just to commemorate that something terrible happened back then? Or as a warning? Because we know that something that bad could easily happen again. And then read this text, number 10. Elliot Rabbah on Orach Chaim 580. On the 9th of Adar, they disagreed, and 3,000 students died. So not only did they bring weapons into the Beit Midrash, but they actually murdered 3,000 students that day. And I want to just pause there, and this is the place for us to have conversation about this and perhaps to hear from some of you, because it feels to me that there's a profound warning here. I mean, when you talk about pluralism in Jewish thought, and when we talk about how Judaism might even differ from other faith traditions, and that we, in our tradition, elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hayu, that there are all these different perspectives, and that for the full revelation to be experienced, we need to be willing to hear the voices of everyone, even from the most marginalized to the most mainstream. And then the rabbis tell a story about those same two who modeled for us what respectful dialogue and discourse could look like, or at least one of them did, and shows what happened the minute the other one gets the upper hand. And and then as the generations go from the Gemara to the Shulchan Aruch to this teacher in 17th century Prague, we learn more and more and more of the story, which either means the story happened and people were trying to hide that reality from us, or whether it happened or not doesn't matter. The rabbis know and understand that it could happen. It could have happened then, and it certainly could happen now. So what happens to our collective discourse when the person who we're engaged in disagreement with is willing to bring a sword to this fight, right? Or a gun to this fight? So when some people are wearing hostage pins and some people are wearing yellow nooses on their lapel, right? How far do the bounds, do you know about what I'm talking about?
Some don't. Go ahead.
In the Knesset over the past 6 months, several members of the Knesset, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, started wearing not a yellow hostage ribbon, but a golden noose to symbolize their desire to pass the law in the Knesset that Palestinians who were convicted of attacks against Jews in the West Bank would be executed within 60 days of that conviction with no chance for appeal and no legal representation. And they celebrated that law by wearing a noose. And actually, on Ben-Gvir's birthday, just a couple weeks ago, he was handed a birthday cake with a giant noose on it. So the reason I raise this is because when you are in a discourse, when you're in a tent with somebody who celebrates violence, somebody who's willing to bring a sword into the Beit Midrash like Shammai, do the same laws apply? Do we still respond, Nochim va'aluvin hayu? Do we still keep our hearts open and share their views even before we share our own? Or is there a boundary, a limit to what voices are allowed into that tent? And then who gets to decide? That's the question that we wanted to pose for us this evening.
It's your turn. What do you think? What should the boundaries be? When is it no longer respectful discourse? Okay?
And just to repeat the question very quickly, are there texts that help us understand the notion of the appropriateness of bringing weapons into the Beit Midrash? Because it seems to Rachel that once someone's bringing a weapon to the disagreement, it's no longer a disagreement. A line has been crossed.
Right. And what happens if the other side wants to kill you? What happens if the other sides are Nazis? Right? I mean, that's what I'm asking about in terms of limits of this. Right? I'm really for really respectful discourse. Mm-hmm. But only for people who are going to allow me to live, despite my religion, despite my views and all of that, right? But if I'm really talking about somebody who wants to get rid of all the Jews, mm-hmm. right? Then at what point is that certainly, it seems to me, is a limit.
I'm just going to repeat your comment over here just to make sure that everybody heard, especially folks from home. And so I hope I'll get all of this right. But you're suggesting that we really need to follow the wisdom of Hillel, which is what is hateful to you, don't do to someone else. And the threat of this kind of violence in the Beit Midrash, as a metaphor, the threat of violence doesn't only come from the far right, but it also comes from the far left. And you're absolutely right about this. And Pape, who I cited earlier, really speaks to that about as part of what makes this moment different, is that there really are 10% of Americans, for example, on the far right, and 10% of Americans on the far left who both advocate for violence, and that part of the danger of this moment is the confluence or the intersection of those two violent extremes. So thank you for your comment. The principle of that we need to love one another as ourselves, that if we took that principle seriously, we would never get to the point where we need to or want or desire to engage violence with one another. And I go back to something Rabbi Dorff was just saying, which is, okay, but what if I cultivate my heart so that I never want to engage in violence against someone else, but somebody else wants to harm me. So what then is my obligation to a person who desires to harm me? And I think that the reason that the reason for the extreme polarity of views now is not because we're bad people. It's because we actually see each other as an existential threat. Right. And so we think we're reacting to that extreme violence, and sometimes we are. And so what is my obligation to you when I believe that you are posing an existential threat to me or to people I love? Does that change the way that I engage you? Do I still have to be curious about you when you want me or people I love to die?
And the Talmud is very explicit. Haba lahargecha, hashkem lahargo. Somebody who comes to kill you, get up early and kill him first. Right? Self-defense is what you are required to do. So then the question is, all right, so that's on a one-to-one level. What about one group against another, Jews against Nazis? Right? There, it's no longer a matter of discussion. There, it's a matter of just self-defense. Right? So, I mean, and notice, by the way, the line that you quoted, we talked about this early on, the two lines that we quoted from Leviticus at the beginning, right? Love your neighbor as yourself comes after rebuke your friend when you need to. Don't bear a grudge or take vengeance. It's only when you do those things that you can love your neighbor as yourself. Right? There's a hand. Yes, go ahead. Absolutely right. I mean, I've been part of the priest-rabbi dialogue since it began in 1973, co-chaired it a number of times. I'm on the board of the Academy of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies. I've got to tell you this story. I was once asked to talk to a group of evangelical leaders about embryonic stem cell research, at Fuller Theological Seminary. And during one of the breaks, I said to this man who, head of a biotech company, I mean, really smart, I said to him, the best thing you guys have going for you is a 1-hour service. How bad can it be, right? And he said to me, trust me, it can be really bad. That's called learning from each other. Right.
I'm just going to repeat Joel's comment very quickly, just for folks who couldn't hear. Joel is part of the men's group at IKAR, where they have done this extraordinary work with a men's group from a church in Nebraska. Over the course of the last several years, they've been meeting with each other, and they have great political differences, but they're able to build a deep relationship rooted in some shared values and something deeper than politics. And I'm going to come back to that when we close, Joel. So thank you both for your incredible work and also for sharing that tonight.
Are we supposed to stop?
We have about 10 more. We have 15 minutes. Okay, so we can take a few more. Do you want to keep going?
Sure, by all means. Okay, I don't know who's first. I think Larry, you were first. Yeah, actually, in a book I wrote a long time ago called To Do the Right and the Good, there's a chapter there on three different grounds for pluralism. One of them is theological, namely that in the Jewish tradition, God is it knows all of our ruchot, all of our traits, our understandings, right? And God wants each one of them to be different, right? Then there's the epistemological humility that I've been talking about tonight, the fact that on a philosophical level, none of us is omniscient. God may be all-knowing, but none of us is. And we have to have a certain amount of epistemological humility to recognize that. And then the third thing is, historically, every single one of the Abrahamic religions is not what its original text was when those were written. Every one of the three Abrahamic religions is based upon a basic text. The Torah for us, the New Testament for the Christians, together with our Bible, and the Quran for Muslims. But then each one of them has a tradition that developed over time based upon how those texts were interpreted and what the people who are committed to those texts turned out to do. The relationship between din and minhag in the Jewish tradition, between law and custom. Right? Or the agadic part of our tradition as well as the halachic part of our tradition. That's not just true for Judaism. That's true in Christianity, the various forms of Christianity, and the various forms of Islam. Right? So the fact that the traditions are not the same as their original texts should give us a sense that things change over time, and that therefore we need to be pluralistic for that reason as well, and recognize that different people will think that the tradition should change on issue X now, and other people will think it should not. That's within our own tradition, right? And so those kinds of, those I think are really strong bases for the requirement of pluralism, and for that pluralism means what we've been talking about. By all means, argue with other people, do it, with as many arguments as you can, but in the end, you need to live with each other, right? And maybe even thrive with each other.
It reminds me of a moment that happened in Jerusalem in the summer of 24. So we were 9 months after October 7th and into the war, and I was at Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I'm part of the RLI, which is a small cohort of rabbis that goes every summer for 4 years. And then there's a much larger cohort of rabbis that comes, you can come once or you can come for 20 or 30 years. And so there were about 250 rabbis in the room, and a scholar got up to give a talk about what was going on in the Jewish family. And he said, if you are anti-Zionist, you are no longer a part of this Jewish family. And there was a gasp in the room, and my immediate thought was, you just told about 150 rabbis that their kids are no longer Jews or part of the Jewish family. Like, what is the point of drawing a line like that people are inside or outside of our Jewish family, instead of, as you're suggesting and as Joel is suggesting through the work that you're doing with the men's group, and as Rabbi Dorff has been preaching and writing about for decades, what would it mean for that scholar to say to one of those kids of his colleagues, tell me about your heart. What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Because we see the world in really different ways right now, and what you're saying scares me, but you're clearly seeing things from a different vantage point than I am. So what can I learn? I mean, if we see each other like family or even like fellow human beings, then we develop a kind of curiosity toward their perspective.
I came across something that Mark Twain wrote a long time ago. You should love your country always. Its government only if it deserves it. Right? I think that's true both as an American and for Israel. Yes. Please.
Can you repeat your question?
We're not hearing you. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I think the question is to repeat the question. But is there not a line that once it's crossed, you are no longer part of the Jewish family? That whether from this side or this side, is there not a perspective that there's just no room for in this tent? And do we not have the tools for that? Namely the tool of excommunication or cherem or nidui. And so I'm curious what you think, and I have a thought about that too. So do you want to go first?
Sure, that doesn't matter.
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I point out to Christian and Muslim audiences is that both of those religions are creedal religions. That is, there are lists of beliefs that you have to affirm, or otherwise you're not part of that religion. If you're a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is Christ in some way or another, and depending upon whether you're Catholic or Protestant of various sorts, Jesus is Christ, and what does that mean? But in any case, if you don't believe that, you're not Christian. If you don't believe that there is only one God and Muhammad is his primary prophet, you can't be Muslim. Right? You may have grown up in an ethnic kind of, you might be Irish or Italian or something, but if you don't believe that Jesus is Christ, that doesn't mean that you're no longer a Christian. In other words, you might be ethnically some of these things, but you're not religiously that. Judaism is not like that. You're defined as being a Jew if you're born to a Jewish woman, or if you're reborn through the rites of conversion. Right? That's part of it. On the one hand, it's wonderful because it enables us to argue ad infinitum. Right? But the other side of it is what you're talking about. Are there any limits? I mean, so what Jews for Jesus? Are they still Jews? Right? Because we're not a creedal religion, it's not easy to say that they're not, especially if they were born to a Jewish woman. And yet, I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine most people in this room, certainly I, would say that they're in believing in Jesus as Christ, they have left the Jewish fold, right? But we don't have a mechanism to do that because we're not a creedal religion. Now, I must say that on the other side of it, if you are a creedal religion, then you get all kinds of hypocrisy, trials, and all of, not hypocrisy, what's it called? Where you are no longer a part of the religion. You have these, and we don't have that. But it's really hard for us to create these limits because we have never defined ourselves in terms of a creed, an official list of beliefs. That doesn't mean that we don't have beliefs. We certainly do have beliefs. And when I talked to Brentwood Presbyterian Church in an hour, I did God, Torah, and Israel as quickly as I could. What does God mean? And what are the variety of views of God? What are the variety of views of the people Israel and the land of Israel and Torah, written Torah, oral Torah, all of that, right? As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful book by Louis Jacobs called Principles of Jewish Belief. Rabbi Louis Jacobs was the founder of the Masorti movement in England. And he was about to become the chief rabbi of England, of the United Kingdom. But then he wrote a book called We Have Reason to Believe. This is the 1950s. And he accepted the documentary hypothesis about how the Torah came to be. Now he was persona non grata in the Orthodox world, and he created the first conservative Masorti synagogue in England. He was also a real scholar, and he wrote this book, Principles of Jewish Belief, and all he did in that book was take Maimonides' 13 principles of Jewish belief, and he showed, he simply listed all of the ways in which each one of them was understood after Maimonides. So for things like Adonai Echad, the Lord is one, 32 different understandings of what those two words mean. We're Jewish, after all, right? Right? So, that's part, again, that's not standard operating procedure in any other religion that I know of. But that's those are the pluses and the minuses of not being a creedal religion.
That was unfortunately we're going to have to close. So I'm going to also try to answer that question very quickly and then we'll wrap. Because I think we can all imagine, and I'm certain that people in this room would have different people who we think are outside the bounds of acceptable ideology and behavior. But I think probably everybody here would agree that there is somebody who's outside the bounds. And so who gets to decide? Right? And what are we to do? And here I want to go back to, I think it's Larry and also Joel, because I think that you're both right, that actually it's important for us to think about bringing the sword into the Beit Midrash, especially in a time of, what does he call it? Populist violence, the era of violent populism. It's important for us to be wary of the kind of violence that can flow from this ideological extremism. And also, most of what's paining us is not actually the violence. It's actually the heartache that comes from seeing people on the other side of history, especially people that you care about. Seeing a post from somebody, on Instagram who you thought really cared about you and you cared about, and then you think, oh, they don't see my humanity at all, right? I think most of it is not actually about the sword or even the gun. Most of it is about our broken hearts. And so what I want to suggest, and I will suggest this by way of sharing some wisdom from a professor named John Powell, who I recently had the honor of being in a public talk with in San Francisco. He's a professor at Berkeley Law, who wrote a new book called Belonging Without Othering. And he writes that the key to belonging is embracing our capacity to imagine each other. And so can we imagine the other person? Instead, the person we want to write out of our story. I'm not talking about somebody who's threatening your life, because that person should not be allowed in this room if they come in with a weapon, right? I'm talking about somebody whose ideas threaten your sense of what is right and wrong. Can we imagine the other? And what he argues is that our world is increasingly polarized, and yet none of us wants to live in a polarized world. And so what we have to do is we have to become, he calls them bridging ambassadors. to the new story that we want to tell about the world. That we have to become bridging ambassadors, every one of us, like not waiting for, some Democratic senator to reach across the aisle to some Republican senator and, like Scalia and RBG and say, I like opera, you like opera. Let's go out. But for us to become bridging ambassadors, because the way that the transformation will happen in this culture, and here I just want to cite the work of Brian Levy, who's a member of IKAR, who might also be in this room right now, who writes brilliantly about South Africa and the ways that society came back from the brink of utter dehumanization is because people started to imagine one another and started to engage in conversations, not with only the people who saw the world exactly the same way, but also people who dafka didn't. And I'm sure that there are a few of you who are certain that you don't see the world the way I do right now. And I'd love to talk to you over watermelon and decaf later tonight. And because this is the only way that we can bring about the kind of culture shift that needs to happen for us to actually transform our society from being at the brink of self-destruction into one that can be on a path toward healing. And if you look at the last text that comes from Rabbi Roth, from Hilchot Gedolot, from the laws of Tisha B'Av, to end where we started. Okay, and then you can end wherever you want. But this text shares. This is from 9th century from Bavel. That in the future, the Holy One will turn these very days, the 9th of Adar, into days of rejoicing and happiness. That the day that was worse for the people Israel than the day of the golden calf, that it was worse for our people because it was the day we actually took that Beit Shammai took up the sword, humiliated Beit Hillel, passed all of those laws that should never have been passed, and then actually massacred 3,000 students of Hillel. That day will go me'evel liyom tov, will be transformed from a day of terrible grief into a day of celebration. And how does that happen? When we're able to see the mistakes of the past and ensure that we are living every day in counter testimony to the culture that led to that kind of violence. So instead of scorning the other for being so extreme and so polarizing, actually becoming the bridging ambassador to the world that we want to live in, engaging each other the way we want the world to engage us.
And along those lines, Hine matov manayim shavarachim gam yachad. Hine matov manayim shavarachim gam yachad. Hine matov shavarachim gam yachad. Hine matov shavarachim gam yachad. Thank you guys for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.